Thank you so much, Dr. Claire Dunning, all the way from Maryland, for joining us today, the author of Nonprofit Neighborhoods. My name is Ron Kim. I am the state representative representing District 40 of Queens. I've been in this position for the last 10 years. I also chair the Committee on Aging, overseeing older adults and senior care throughout the state of New York. I am super excited about this opportunity to spend some time with Claire on her work and research on the impact of the nonprofits and their roles, especially in urban cities throughout America, and what that means for public service and creating public value at a time when we need it the most. This is at times a very uncomfortable topic because in urban politics, we have so many allies, liberals, progressives, lefties, everyone that's in the movement that often work in these nonprofits. And this is by no means to try to invalidate or attack what they're doing as social workers or nonprofit workers. They're delivering results every single day for our communities. But Claire makes an important distinction between outcomes and solving the cause of our social decline in our communities. And these are the type of topics that we want to try to dive into with Claire tonight. But first, I'd like to just ask about your background and how did you end up studying this particular topic?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Writing a book and doing research feel like a really solo, isolating activity sometimes. And so putting ideas out into the world and then getting to be in conversation with people who sort of actually can create the change that we'd like to see in the world is really wonderful. So thanks for reading the book and having me on. So I came to these questions. I graduated from college. I wanted to save the world, right? That sort of idealistic undergraduate mindset. And I went to work at a community foundation, which was a phenomenal job. I learned so much about the nonprofit sector, about social change, about intractable problems. But it was also an incredibly frustrating position. And so it was a real insight into the power dynamics of private philanthropy and nonprofit organizations. I learned about how nonprofits received far more government funding than I sort of ever realized, that these private, seemingly independent entities were deeply intertwined in some positive ways and negative ways with different tiers of government. But it also really gave me insight into, we were trying to solve some really deep-seated structural issues of poverty, racial inequality, the wealth gap. And yet we were thinking in 3-year grant cycles. We were thinking about, how do you fine-tune a theory of change? How do you work on, better evaluation? And those are all really important questions for nonprofits, right? I don't want to dismiss that. But to me, it seemed like there needed to be a bigger conversation here. And that I was sort of teased for me at this job, right? I wanted to understand, why in the United States do we try and solve big problems with really small organizations? And why do we try and solve public problems with private solutions? So there seemed to be this sort of scalar mismatch, big problems, small entities, and public problems, private strategies. And that didn't make sense to me. And I wanted to understand, right, how did we get to this system? And it was also a moment that I think isn't worth naming. It was the Great Recession. So need was up and funding was down. So nothing about this seemed to sort of make sense. There seemed to be countercyclical funding in ways that weren't actually getting at the deeper issues. And my colleagues knew this, right? Plenty of leaders in the nonprofit sector knew this, and yet we kept in these patterns. So to me, that was a big question and a big historical question, right? I'm trained as a historian. And so I wanted to understand why we had this system and the role of nonprofit organizations in urban governance, what their relationships were to the government, and why it looked like it did. So I went to graduate school, and then I wrote a book after it.
Well, it is such a timely book, and I was telling you last week that I was talking to my staff about this very topic of an outsourced government that we're seeing all around us, and no one seems to be focused on it or talking about it, that we're privatizing a lot of the public work. And because many of the new electeds, the younger generation, we just kind of walked into this and we just think this is the norm, that we just can't even envision a different type of service. That it's almost like, as politicians, our job is to cut checks to these nonprofits and celebrate that, and that becomes the currency to our with our colleagues, a social currency to determine how great we are as politicians. And sometimes it also leads to our re-elections. Like that's how communities often measure the role of electeds. And I don't know how we got here when we don't have to actually solve anything, but if we just deliver some money for a nonprofit that claims that they're going to fix this problem in the future, that's good enough without actually delivering results. But I do think the time is changing. People are waking up and feeling frustrated at everyone. And oftentimes they don't even know who to point fingers at, because by the time the public dollars are all the way down to the local nonprofits, we don't know who's actually accountable for those dollars, because it's not, the revenue stream is coming from the federal government, from Medicaid, from state, from city, and people can't even look at one person to hold those dollars accountable to. So that's kind of what I'm seeing on the ground. But what is a nonprofit neighborhood, and why the focus in Boston? And I asked that question first because even though, and you mentioned the work of Freedom House in Boston, and even now I can connect like 10, 20 different organizations in my backyard that's going through the same exact patterns that happened so many years ago in Boston and Freedom House. So can you elaborate about what is a nonprofit neighborhood, and why the Freedom House and why Boston?
Yeah, so the title of the book is Nonprofit Neighborhoods, and I use it as a sort of conceptual map to how do we capture, not just at the individual organizational level, but how do we recognize that in urban areas, in American cities, nonprofits do a significant amount of work, right? So your points earlier about they represent communities, right, in the political system in an informal kind of way. They deliver goods and services, and they really broker or mediate the relationship that residents have to the state and the market in the sort of more abstract sense. And I wanted to recognize how that's spatially located, right, to sort of locate the nonprofit industrial complex, as we sometimes call it, in urban neighborhoods, but to also recognize that these are not places where the public sector is absent. They're just ones where the sort of inadequacies of the public sector are met with nonprofit supplement. And it's no accident that these nonprofit neighborhoods, these places where nonprofits do a significant amount of the service delivery and the brokering, are traditionally excluded populations, right? These are Black, Latinx, Asian American communities. And that's no accident, right? These are places that were places and people that were structurally excluded. And in the Black freedom movement and the Latinx movement, right, freedom movements in the 20th century, people recognized the inadequacy of municipal service delivery, mobilized, protested, used the tools of social movements to sort of say, these are our organizations and we can do a better job than the government that in delivering services. We want a degree of community control, right? So on the one hand, we can see the development of nonprofit neighborhoods as a victory of freedom movements, right? People saying we've been excluded and here's our space to control and our organizations. Feels like a really important victory, and I don't want to discount that. At the same time, these are also spaces that continue to be unequal. They continue to be places where nonprofit brokering and delivery of services is not the same as a fully funded municipal service delivery. So they're also products of the rise of neoliberalism, right? Nonprofit neighborhoods are places where private service delivery, competition between groups, vulnerability, financial precarity for organizations and people continue to dominate and shape people's lives. So I wanted to sort of recognize how spaces and neighborhoods are shaped by organizations and shape organizations, and how that's really racialized in the United States.
So go
Sorry.
ahead. Yeah,
No,
sorry,
and
finish.
you asked me why Boston.
Yeah.
So Boston is both unique and not at all, right? A lot of the money that I follow coming into organizations like Freedom House in Boston are from federal grant programs, right? The War on Poverty in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson's 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, sort of release in an unprecedented way federal dollars that begin to go to these local community organizations. And Boston was on the forefront of that in many ways, right? Its sort of reputation as a liberal city, we can, whether that's accurate or not, it likes to see itself as a liberal city. It had clear ties to the Johnson and before that Kennedy administration. So Boston was sort of on the forefront of these trends, right? Likes to see itself as the city on the hill, progressive tradition, that embraced nonprofit organizations and really sort of brokered new ways of governing in the city from the 1950s onward. But the monies that's coming in, the patterns that you're seeing, right? The fact that Freedom House looks familiar to you in New York is because these patterns were happening all over the United States. The sort of efflorescence of new organizations, the expanding role of existing ones. Same things happening in cities across the US as these federal dollars are trickling down into communities. So Boston is both sort of a stand-in for other places, but also sort of on the leading edge of where what's happening in Boston is sometimes getting exported. But I think it has to be a story told on the ground, right? That's where people are negotiating and fighting to get their organizations visible, to sort of think about racial inequality and what the role of the nonprofit sector could be or hasn't been or might be in mitigating both immediate needs and structural conditions.
You also mentioned in your writing some of the I guess I don't think you use the word corruption. Sometimes I think you use corruption, like municipal patronage. You know, the back in the day of all the jobs going to Tammany Hall, etc. That was very. So it's almost they've also created this environment where they lost trust at that time period with the public, and right when all these federal dollars were coming in, asking them to develop and asking them to bring in new housing projects, et cetera, under the guise of, as you say, as you pointed out, the urban renewal movement. And as a nonprofit, I just feel like if I don't, I feel very, sympathetic to their position in all this, because it's like a classic, like kind of MBA class where, like, if I don't take this, the money's going to go somewhere else and I need to be competitive. And what am I supposed to do here? Like, there's all this money coming my way. Like, I'm going to take these contracts and I'm going to, do my best to deliver whatever outcomes that they're asking me for. So I don't, and then you point that out, you articulate this point much better than I do in the book, that this isn't an attempt to invalidate the decisions that they made and the positions that they've taken. But now, what, from a nonprofit's position, what can they do to kind of say, hey, like, maybe this shouldn't be outsourced, and what do they do, taking on, stopping the role of proxy government as a nonprofit? Like, I mean, how difficult do you think that is in this juncture, now that we are here, where we created this kind of shadow government under these nonprofits?
I really like how you framed that, as we can be really empathetic and sort of understand why organizations and people made these choices, because it was an incredible victory, right? There was skepticism of the government for good reason, right? Municipal governments, the federal governments in the mid 20th century were sources of continuing racial inequality. The government was the problem in a lot of ways for these marginalized communities. It's why they were marginalized, right? Policy had allowed discrimination, segregation to persist, and not just allowed, had encouraged it, right? So there was reason that the government was sort of the target of a lot of ire for these mid-century social movements. So to claim the opportunity to claim a share of federal money and get recognized, the legitimacy, the opportunity, the power that that came with, that was something that people fought vehemently for, and was sort of a huge victory to sort of recognize that Black neighborhoods, Latinx neighborhoods, Asian neighborhoods had a role in sort of self-governing. So that was a huge victory. But these dollars, right, as your point said, they come with a lot of strings attached, and that can steer in a lot of different directions, right? One of the groups I write about, their staff it was a security program at a public housing development in the south end of Boston. And the community organizers start delivering surplus food and sort of escorting elderly to the mailboxes. But their federal funders say, no, 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 that's too far outside the bounds of what we funded you for, right? So these are systems of discipline. The funding's really uneven. Staff get cut all the time, right? If you're running a program for 8 months of the year, how do you make payroll for the other 4? So these are both a victory, but they're not great, necessarily consistent, predictable dollars. And now, to your point, we've inherited this system where it doesn't make sense to say no. Nonprofit leaders recognize that this system isn't necessarily working to achieve the ultimate goal that many are working towards of more equitable, just, and fair urban living cities, right? So your question is sort of, what do we do about that? And one of the things that I think history points to is that political organizing, pushing back, right? It seems risky to bite the hand that feeds you. And there's a reason that nonprofits have been sort of disciplined to avoid the political sphere, but advocacy and sort of pushing back on the inadequacy of what they're doing is really, really important. And so my message would be both nonprofits need to sort of name their inadequacy, which feels risky when funding's involved. But the message is just as important for funders, right, of both the public variety and the philanthropic, that organizing is the most important tactic we have towards long-term sustainable change. So the sort of pressures to depoliticize nonprofit organizations, I get that pressure, and we need to figure out ways to alleviate it. We need to keep pushing politically and recognize that these kinds of outsourced, privatized systems of service delivery aren't getting where we want to go, right? And in fact, they're serving the needs of keeping power relationships intact. There's something deeply constrained that we're sort of perpetuating inequalities by relying on these precarious organizations often to deliver goods and services, whether it's affordable housing, after school programs, park cleanups. Those are all really important, and they're also really inadequate if we're doing it through these small grant funded programs. And what it's going to take are the kinds of things that you're leading on about what is the political conversation? How do we create political space to push back on this system? Because this was never the end goal, right? That the movements of people who founded organizations in the 1960s, they had higher aims. They were fighting for a more just and fair world. And the nonprofit service delivery was a step in that direction, and we've sort of become stalled. That the means has sort of become the end, and we need to remember what the end actually was. And most nonprofit leaders know that, and they're being constrained and sort of limited in how much they can say that aloud.
And I think it's also important that you actually have terms to name some of these spaces and what it is. And I think it's important that we call these things something. And one of the terms that you use is private inclusion. And I think other professor from Princeton, Kiangra, also calls it predatory inclusion, which is similar in line what you're getting at as well. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like, oh, I feel included now, but what am I actually being included for? We're just perpetuating privatization and predatory practices that's ultimately in the long run hurting us. And just because I'm a minority, I'm an Asian, I'm an immigrant, I have a seat at the table, I'm actually doing the same harm in the long run back to my community. I'm not really fighting to liberate the traditionally underserved communities, and I'm just putting a kind of a marketized web around them to continue to enforce racial and gender hierarchy to some extent. And it's almost like a perfect win for, I feel like, right winners, right? Like, and the conservative movement, they don't have to lift a finger, and they're like, okay, we're going to create this amazing neoliberal cities, and we don't have to do any work. That we just have to dangle some money and perpetuate an economy of scarcity and give the power to nonprofits to dangle some money. That's not enough for public service, but we will be reinforcing the right behavior that way. And I just feel like when it comes to right-wing privatization, such as public schools and charter schools, we have a coalition that will always step in from the left and hold that line. But who is holding the line in urban cities when progressives are part of the neoliberal movement and privatizing public service? And that's kind of where I am. Like, I'm a hardcore progressive, radical left, on economic policies. And I'm having difficult conversations, and I'm having uncomfortable conversations one by one, and trying to create space. But circling back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, organizing and building solidarity in this moment is so hard because the clients that our constituents that they're serving are aligned with the nonprofits. Whereas when like many decades ago, when there was an opportunity to, let's say, keep like the care work or childcare or home care inside of government, those constituents were aligned with bureaucracies, governments, and local counties, etc. But now they're aligned and almost controlled by the nonprofit providers who are interacting with them on an everyday basis. And as well as labor groups. So the traditional groups that would be in line to deliver public service for our most vulnerable constituents, if they're misaligned to achieve the ultimate goal that we want, how difficult is the organizing part to kind of re-educate and get them back to understand there is a better path here. Let's not take the first marshmallow. Let's wait for a better future that our founders of these nonprofits envisioned, and not set up for less.
Yeah, I think it's risky. That's really hard work, right? Because we know that our constituents are really vulnerable. And so it feels risky to say, let's not keep fighting for a slice of the pie. Let's try and enlarge the pie. I mean, yes, politically, but there's risk involved. And so I think we have to demonstrate that the pie can get bigger, and that just fighting for these sort of scraps at the table, while meaningful and important, we need both, right? That people need these goods and services, and we need to find a way to come into coalition and expand that. And people are doing that work, right? So I think it's important to recognize that these are, to your point, conversations that are happening. Because, right, my sort of this notion of privatized inclusions, nonprofits have won a seat at the table. It's an incredible achievement. And yet, right, to have a community's needs represented through these nonprofits, that's not the same thing. There's a second-class citizenship version of that that's not standing in direct relationship to government. And so I think there's a way that we need to talk about, how do we expand the public sector? How do we expand public good provision? How do we make government something that's a good in people's lives and not something to shrink away from? Because one of the things that's been a real challenge, I think, and a real sort of moment of realization for me in writing this book and in the research for it, is that people fought so hard to promote these nonprofit organizations as a vehicle towards a more just and equitable city. And yet that has been used to spin a narrative of the reverse, right? So that's why I think it's important to recognize that, individual organizations aside, the rise of nonprofits and urban governments has fueled a neoliberal vision of the city, right? Not to say that the people involved on their own would identify as neoliberals, but they've enabled a narrative of private's better, They've enabled a narrative of, oh, this is being handled elsewhere, that less government is good, hidden government is good. And so it's enabled these narratives, particularly among the business class and the elites, to say, oh, look, these nonprofits are handling things, right? This is a preferred means of governance. And there's been some sort of strange bedfellows politically of people agreeing that, right, there's sort of a lot of agreement that doing things via nonprofits is the way forward. And there's reasons why that's true, but we also need to name the limitations of that as an urban governance strategy, such that when we're coming out of the 1980s, right, this sort of contraction of federal spending that the Reagan administration accelerated, right, nonprofits suffered significantly and their communities suffered significantly. And the way forward seemed like embracing the market, embracing the narrative of private alternatives, even if it's wearing a nonprofit face. And so this notion of private inclusion, I try and sort of use as a way of recognizing that urban governance has become more decentralized. It's become more diverse. Communities have gained degrees of control, but it's still not enough. How can we name the inadequacy without demonizing the important work that these organizations do? And so to me, that there's both things to celebrate and criticize, and we need to create political space for those criticisms about how the existing arrangement of nonprofit delivered goods and services and the relationships to government aren't working, right? Because the notion of partnerships, right, public-private partnerships, it seems like the quote win-win, everyone's involved, but they're not partnerships of equals. These are highly unequal relationships, right, where government's still holding the sort of funding strings, nonprofits are constrained, they're not always held accountable. There's a lot of problems here. So I think we can hold both the limitations of this strategy and recognize the achievements so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's tied to what we said earlier at the beginning of our conversation about the difference between focusing on outcomes, outcomes, efficient deliverables versus actually improving the social conditions, the decline social conditions and the root causes of poverty, intergenerational trauma and pain. A nonprofit that's mission driven to focus on one outcome is not going to solve those social problems. That's deeply connected to larger investment pools. And to your point about the relationship not being equal. I mean, we're seeing with the NFL quarterback in Mississippi. I don't know if you've been reading about what's been going on about this controversy. It's a scandal involving Brett Favre and a nonprofit conduit that executed on transferring public dollars to build a gymnasium for his daughter's college, and the governor of that state, former governor, used a contract agency nonprofit group that was supposed to deliver welfare services to transfer the public dollars. And what does a nonprofit do? I mean, when you're contractee, most nonprofits would do exactly what this person did, because the governor that's holding your purse of all the money calls you, hey, I need you to cut this check for this project. And I think that's a much large scandal. But every single day, politicians, mayors, governors call nonprofits to come to a press conference, to stand with them, to make them look good, and it's not politicized, but they certainly give them cover. And our former governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, was a master at using these federal dollars, to bring women's rights groups, bring Asian groups, and stand with them at press conferences to make him look like a hero every time he cut a check for them. And I just think the whole practice just, it creates corruption and corrupt behavior, and it doesn't, without the actual deliverables and accountability, because by the time it leaves government's hands, from the contract, the subcontract, no one's keeping really track of how this money is being spent. And most of the post audits reveal a number of corrupt things and misspendings, and I've never seen a case in New York where we actually clawed back any of that retroactively. So we know this, but I think people are just like, what's the alternative? Like, I don't know. They can't even imagine a different type of a public service in urban cities anymore. And it wasn't like this. I mean, it just, it was just a few decades ago where we had a different approach in places like California and other states. I just don't, but within 20, 30 years, generationally, it feels like we lost the institutional knowledge to build public good. And this is a topic that my students and I are constantly discussing these days. But do you think that there is a knowledge deficit in the public, building side? Because 100 years ago, Woodrow Wilson wrote white papers on how to build better administrations, and people actually, ran for office, touting public service and we're going to build public good, but no one does that anymore.
So you said so many things that I want to respond to. One of the things, to your point about accountability, one of the reasons that we sort of politically outsource goods to nonprofits is because we claim it's more efficient, and it's not. It's not necessarily more efficient. And why is efficiency necessarily our highest value when we're talking about serving people in our communities? So this notion of outsourcing is efficient. To your point, it takes a lot of bureaucratic oversight or lack thereof in managing these relationships. So I wanted to respond to that. I also think in terms of, have we lost knowledge of how to create big things? Yes and no. I think the knowledge is out there. It's just being structurally quieted, right? To the point about these power relationships, about funders aren't interested in amplifying the voices of people who are talking about expanding the public sphere. And we were able to dream big about the public sphere when who the public was a white middle-class male two-family household, right? I think who the public we're building for, we need to recognize that when we built and invested in public institutions, they were exclusionary institutions, right? We've never fully built public institutions where the public is an accurate and full public. The public has always been conceived as white, middle-class, heterosexual, working. We've never invested because of the ways that racial stigmas penetrate all over our public policy system. So I think it's not returning to an older generation of public investment and public capacity. It's going somewhere we haven't even been yet. It's recognizing that we need to build institutions where the whole public can be served, whether that's higher education, K through 12, healthcare provision, housing. We need to build, and the reason we haven't is because, right, we know historically that once the Black freedom movement and other associated freedom movements began claiming their rightful place in accessing public goods and services, that's when the clawback happened. That's when we turned to the private sector. It was an alternate form of segregation. And I think we have to name that. That's why we have these alternate privatized systems. It's been a way of mitigating protest. It's been a way of managing inequality ineffectively, right? So busing in Boston is sort of the quintessential moment of chaos when the courts said that a segregated school system could not continue in the 1970s and created plans to bus Black children into predominantly white neighborhoods and vice versa. And it was an extraordinarily violent response of white violence attacking children on school buses. And nonprofits really took government dollars and helped keep children safe. They used these public safety grants in the 1970s to protect buses of kindergartners trying to go to school. And the mayor was very happy about this. He said, look, the nonprofits are taking care of it. The Black-led organizations are preventing violence. This was a great political moment, right? It's the 1970s version of calling people forward for a press conference and sort of having a more visually diverse audience behind you. But then busing ended, the groups were successful, and there was no more dollars, right? They never actually built a more equal school system. They just sort of did a temporary fix. And we've been living with temporary fixes in one form or another for a really long time. And there's value there. We need temporary fixes, right? Surviving is not always guaranteed. And so I think it's important to recognize that nonprofits help people stay alive. But that's not the same thing as thriving, right? Improving outcomes is not the same thing, right? We were talking earlier about eliminating the structural causes. And so to me, eliminating the structural causes is the sort of returning to the big vision about who is the public, who are we trying to serve, what would public capacity and public institutions look like, and how can we invest in a way that creates equal access for all? Because the sort of minoritized version of private inclusion, right, that I talk about isn't getting where we need to be.
I think what you just said for the last minutes, I think was incredibly powerful in the context of how all this is deeply rooted in our racist past and institutionalized racism that have drove these points where we pivoted in certain directions. And the way that you put it together, I think was very powerful. So thank you for sharing all that. We are currently dealing with also similar patterns in districts like mine in the care sector. So I know I forwarded some papers along your way and articles, but in particularly with community and home care. In the 1990s, there was a conscious effort to allow Medicaid to be to institute waived Medicaid programs at the federal level, which sparked a national scrambling of how to administer home and community care. And one state in particular, California, through coalition building with consumers, labor, and nonprofits, they fought to keep home care and community care as a public service. So it's the governments and local governments that administer, and home care workers are considered public servants in California to this day. Other states adopted the contract model and completely created this waiver programs at the state level to administer home care. And now we're seeing in the back end a system that lacks all accountability. Collectively, the industry owes $6 billion of back wages to workers in the state of New York, going back 10 years. In my community alone, about $60 million are owed to some of the most vulnerable women, immigrant workers that we often talk about being the heroes. Right? Every politician would love to go on social media. This is about carrying economy, and these are the people that we need to prop up. But when it comes to having difficult conversations about why it's broken and why the providers, why the nonprofits are not being held accountable, they don't want to talk about it. So it's been super difficult navigating the channels without making people feel invalidated, because they inherited a lot of these institutionally broken systems. But we're finally at a point we're having some real conversations and some real change conversations to make the system better. But you, looking at what's going on with the home care sector, are you seeing similar patterns historically play out here? Do you feel like there's any hope that perhaps with the care sector, we can end this cycle of private inclusion and there's a better path that we can forge with the care workers?
And the work that your office is doing to bring attention to that is really important. One of the things that I find frustrating about talking and writing about the nonprofit sector is it incorporates or encompasses huge organizations, right? Hospitals and universities, and teeny tiny after school programs. And then we've got these sort of major contractors that are both big and small that sort of fall somewhere in between. So there's a lot of diversity of organizations in the sector, and that makes it hard to talk about sometimes, right? To sort of paint with broad brush strokes. But the work that your office is doing to draw attention to the care economy and how these contract systems have left workers incredibly vulnerable is no accident, right? And that the people who we're seeing in the home healthcare field, right, it's a predominantly female-dominated workforce, predominantly women of color, predominantly with an immigrant background, right? With people who have multiple levels of vulnerability, right? There's no accident, right? So one of the things that we know historically is that the rise of the quote eds and meds coming out of a post deindustrialization in the early 20th century, that these jobs were sort of envisioned as the next phase of urban employment, the care sector, and the sort of higher ed realm. And the federal government recognized this and created a lot of jobs. They were called, quote, new careers in the 1960s that were job training programs. It was one of the few actual job creating programs of the war on poverty. And they were supposed to be, quote, good jobs, and they were supposed to be for men. But then women predominantly started to occupy them, and the sort of idea of a job ladder was pulled up. That once women started occupying these jobs, it's sort of the presence of women in the field naturalized the low wages. It was a way to justify that this was a feminine profession. The care work, it makes us feel good, and therefore is worthy of low wages and exploitative work conditions. And those patterns have continued, as you've drawn a lot of attention to, whether it's via a for-profit or a nonprofit, that the ways that these contract systems have been enabled to replicate the deepest inequalities of American capitalism. And so it's both not surprising, unfortunately, to sort of see the kinds of abuses that you've drawn attention to in the back wages and really inhospitable, if not violent and physically demanding labor that people are producing from a population that is, again, sort of seemingly most vulnerable towards fighting back against that, though we're obviously seeing that workers are fighting back and naming the injustices that they're being made to experience.
Yeah, I mean, what does make me feel optimistic, though, right, is that there was a point where some states got it right, and some states saw that, hey, just because Medicaid is now they're putting a waiver and on a Medicaid, there might be a deficit if we as a government at the local level and the state level don't meet the moment of this distribution of federal funds. We are going to make sure that we protect this pot of federal money by delivering guaranteed and fully financed care work that protects the workers and the patients at the same time, and not going to punt this responsibility to third parties as we do with everything else. And I just found it incredible that in these 2-3 years in the 1990s in California, they just organized and went up against a huge enemy, and they won, and they were able to keep it as a public service. And that gives me incredible hope that the model exists, and it's not like 100 years ago. This is fairly recent, and we can go back and build better allyship with these nonprofits to really deliver public service. And my hope that if anyone's listening in that are from the nonprofits, again, like we need you, we need the clients, we need a better coalition building to get this done. And I hope that they're listening in. It's almost 8:15, and I'm just going to let some of my students, if they have any questions, you could put in the chat room, or you could raise your hand if you like. We're going to go to them maybe around 8:20, and then we're going to try to wrap it up around 8:25, if that's okay with you, Claire.
Sounds great. No, I think one of the things that you said that's really important is we sort of frame these partnerships. They used to be always called a win-win, but I think we're at a lose-lose, right? No one's winning. These systems are not working. Care isn't being delivered in a safe and humane way. Workers are not being compensated for what they're doing. And so we can sort of question, right, to your point, like there are other paths out there, and we need to work in coalition and recognize that these processes are not working, whether it's for-profit, nonprofit, public. There are tools at our disposal, and they're policy-based tools, right? Policies can change how these goods and services are being delivered, and they might still flow through the nonprofit sector, right? We don't need to demonize that process, but we can add a lot more accountability. We can add a lot more enforcement and monitoring, such that the intention is actually being met. But there's a fear of actually sort of using the tools of grabbing hold of the political, of the policy, that we tiptoe around too much around sort of naming the power dynamics here. And I think if we recognize this sort of as a lose-lose, like, let's go back to the drawing board and let's go back together.
I mean, is there a possible, or let me ask, like, has there been a successful attempt or an outcome where a nonprofit filled a void, and then a public authority or a government agency looked at what they were delivering and folded that in and made it into a right that those populations deserve? Like, we've gone the other direction, but historically, have we ever? I know that I think there might have been one public authority that was folded into the Department of Commerce, like one of the fleet corporations that was created through a nonprofit government, that they serve such a great need that they just folded it into a government agency. But I'm wondering if any municipal governments at any point in our history said, "Hey, you're doing a great job of serving these constituents, and we should be guaranteeing those services, and we're going to put a government agency behind it."
I'm sure there are examples. I'm going to say none come to mind right now. So I'm sure there are outliers, but the vast majority of the narrative has been sort of tempting, right? Sort of promising that, but never actually doing it, right? The ethos of government grant making and philanthropic grant making is this notion of experimentation. If we just innovate our way out of it, we only have to find the solutions and then scale it. But that scaling never happens. That sort of investment of how do we grow and sort of solidify this as a right never happens. It's that final step where everything, every program, every policy is about, oh, let's just test and find the solution. We know what the solutions are. The issues to poverty are more money, higher wages, solid incomes, right? Stable and secure housing. We don't need to discover many of those solutions. People know what they need, and people know what would build the better, equitable cities that people want to see. We're just not willing to invest in them. So this notion of experimentation is out there, and it never happens. It never gets adopted or absorbed into the government program. Though I will say the one place where it has been in the carceral state, right? The expansion, right? That shows we can invest in the public sphere if it's in the carceral realm. And there's been extraordinary growth in, police departments, carceral capacity. We can do investments in the public if we choose to. We just haven't chosen to.
Right, because they serve a role in protecting private capital. So it's just one circuitous rope. I have a question from Sasha. I'm curious how you see the transition actually happening into a larger system of public capital. What should coalitions be visualizing this system of robust public capital to look like, so as to not replicate government mistakes of the past, like exclusion and white supremacy, things like nonprofit workers being hired into government, governments absorbing nonprofit orgs somehow, etc. How might it actually happen or look in the future?
I think it's reducing competition. I think it's bringing nonprofits into coalition and social movement building. I think it has to be about organizing and demanding public goods, and that requires public spending and expanding government provision, right? Investing in the public school system rather than paying for a lot of after school options or charter schools, right? Let's actually improve the existing systems. But you're right, there is a risk of replicating past mistakes. People have been working really hard. They haven't always gotten it right, but people were earnestly trying to do what they thought was the right thing at the time. So Sasha, your question about how do we do so cautiously, I think we do so in coalition. We do so by lifting up the people who are closest to the lived experience that we're trying to address, right? So people coming in with the identities of those who we're trying to put at the center, right? So that means putting previously minoritized persons in elected office, in policymaking positions, in places of power. But it's hard and it's going to take a long time, but movement organizing is, to me, the way forward in creating coalitions and creating public will. And I think we're seeing that happen, right? The student debt conversations have accelerated tremendously over the past few months and years, thanks to the organizing of a lot of grassroots entities.
Yeah, I feel like whenever we talk about public good or public capital, public takeover, or anything that involves public value and involves minorities, people of color, women, immigrants, etc., we always get reduced to being a radical socialist communist nut job. Like that's like, and it's not taken seriously. And we were put into a category. But I find it very ironic that the only public bank in the entire country at the state level is in North Dakota, serving mostly Republicans and conservatives and non-minority populations. So when it comes to public good in the forms of even banking, they don't call those Republican socialist communists in North Dakota. There's definitely this kind of racial dynamic that continue to persist. And when urbanites demand rights at the level of what traditional white communities have received, we are reduced to being too radicalized or too, whatever. But knowing that and knowing like, historically, not just minorities, but even presidents have struggled to pitch to the American public how to build public capital without being accused of being a communist or going after individualism, liberty, freedom, or whatever that the people have so stuck on. They've done, successful leaders have almost used corporatist capitalist language back against them, and whether it's competition, efficiency, so I think also, do you think that's also important as we figure out solutions that we need to, like, language and messaging, and how to organize and lower people's filters, because Americans are very, very like fearful and fear driven, and fear mongering is such an effective tool, as you know, in political organizing, especially in times of social media and people have short attention spans. They're just not as focused in long-term solutions.
Yeah, your point about, right, we keep coming back to who the public is, right? If the public are predominantly white men, then public good provision is great if that's who's occupying the public. But once we recognize the public for the diversity that it is, right, there's a huge contraction of public goods and services. So, which is why universal policies, I think, are the important way to protect access to minoritized communities, right? Universal goods and services are a sort of essential part of policymaking, to protect exactly what we said, right? The extraction when people of color occupy and make claims on the public. But messaging, I think is key, is essential here.
Is there? We just have a couple more minutes. I just love our conversation, Claire. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm just floating in different directions. Are there potential nonprofit models that, and I know you hate the word, like, people talk about innovation and like people talk about like, win-win, and then, you think, that's just one giant scam that we just love to pitch. But I'm just wondering, like, is there a secret toolbox that's sitting at the 501c3 world where they haven't really leveraged yet? Like, if I'm a government contractor and I'm getting a federal $100 million grant, is there a possibility that a 501c3 can scale, leverage that money, in a more effective way, or grow that pot of money? Does that make sense? Like, instead of government, if I hold on to the government agency versus putting it into a nonprofit private market, like, is there a way to track if that money is being leveraged by a large mega nonprofit in a way that perhaps it can't be leveraged in the government sector? Does that, yeah.
Yeah, if I think I'm following your question, one of the things that nonprofits can do that governments can't is they can take philanthropic donations, right? The leverage that's coming is coming from the private sector. It's coming from philanthropy, and that's real, right? So there's been co-investment historically between governments and and foundations that, for government provision, you lose that. Right. So there's real advantage there. It's one of the things that nonprofits can boast about, is talking about their leverage of combining both philanthropic and government dollars. And that's real. Whether nonprofits actually have deep ties to the community, that's an advantage to the government, right? There's reasons why these things exist, that nonprofits can meet community needs in theory. They can access minority preferences in a different kind of way than government does. And they can often do so with a different set of tools in their toolbox. So there is something to be saved there, right? We don't want to throw everything out, but the points about accountability, I think, are key. And what's the sort of magic thing in the toolbox? I think we have to name, right? Let's put reparations as a word on the table. If we're talking about, and we're right at time and I'm throwing out reparations, but if we're talking about creating public value, right? We can't keep working in the same set of tools without reckoning with legacies of racial exclusion. We just have to name that, right? The relationships that nonprofits and urban governments have today is a reflection of our inadequate response to long-term practices and ongoing processes of racial exclusion. And so whether that's a conversation about reparations, let's have it, right? Because only by really getting at and naming the traditions of white supremacy are we actually going to get closer to the roots. Because otherwise, we can innovate and we can experiment, we can fine tune accounting practices, and we can add accountability in. But if we're not getting at those roots or not getting at those shared origins, we're just going to keep spinning our wheels.
Wow, that was amazing, Claire. Thank you so much. I think that definitely inspires a lot of my students and the work they've done. Thank you, Sasha, for the clap back. And we're going to be posting this again on some of our media channels and in our class. And I'm sure we'll have some questions moving forward, and we'll love to stay in touch with some of those discussions.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation, truly.
And lastly, before we log off, if you haven't, please read, maybe not through Amazon, but
yes, buy from your local bookstore.
Local bookstore, but it doesn't matter. I got it from Amazon. I'm sorry, but it's an amazing book. It really just ties in a lot of the questions that we're having as public servants, nonprofit professionals. And I gotta tell you, a lot of my students do work in the nonprofit space, and the fact that they're having these honest and uncomfortable conversations gives me hope that this next generation of leaders that are stepping into these roles are cognizant or aware, and they're willing to find real solutions. So your work, I think, will be invaluable to them and other leaders' growth in the near future. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for this conversation and the work that you're doing, because research can only take us so far. So thank you to you.